George Carter faked his death and took me to get the divorce certificate. He said, "Angela, I can't be selfish and let you waste your entire life on me." In my previous life, I was deeply moved by those words. I took care of his parents in his place and endured a lifetime of hardship, guarding that family for my entire life. Only when I was on my deathbed did I finally learn the truth. Long ago, he had already changed his name and awakened to a new identity. Using my dowry to exchange for a bright future, he lived freely and comfortably with a beloved wife and young children. This time, I accepted the divorce certificate and immediately moved out, taking all of my dowry with me. My parents-in-law and my brother-in-law were left staring at the empty house in shock. They grabbed my parents and demanded to know where I had gone. My parents looked openly pleased as they replied, "Our daughter divorced your so-called dead son a long time ago. Where do you get the nerve to demand that our daughter support you, her former parents-in-law and former brother-in-law?" Reborn into this life, George Carter still dragged me to get divorced. He knew very well that in this era, once a woman divorced, she would carry endless unfounded insults and stigma. Yet he still placed the divorce certificate into my hands, hypocritically performing his so-called deep affection. "Angela, I love you, so I can't drag you down. After the divorce, you'll be able to meet someone better." I nodded. Compared to what I suffered in my previous life, getting a divorce certificate and bearing some slander meant nothing to me now. In my previous life, when George learned that the woman he cherished as his white moonlight, Ivy Lee, had divorced, he became restless and tormented. Yet at that time, I had been married to him for less than a year. I was filial to my parents-in-law and considerate toward relatives and friends. No one could say a single bad word about me. George could not find a legitimate reason to divorce me, so he used terminal cancer and claimed he could not bear to drag me down as an excuse, forcing the divorce. He was certain that I loved him wholeheartedly and would never abandon him. After the divorce, I still stayed in his home, supporting his frail parents after his supposed death and raising his younger brother, Greg Carter, through school. 30 years later, I was worn down by exhaustion and illness. Childless and alone, I collapsed on a hospital bed with no one visiting or caring for me. Meanwhile, my parents-in-law were healthy and strong, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and Greg Carter was successful in his career. Not only did he never come to see me, he even brought George, who had already died, and changed his name, together with Ivy Lee back home, reuniting as a happy family. They laughed together in warmth and joy. Ivy Lee wore an expensive mink coat and looked at me with mocking pity as she said, "Angela, George never loved you. He lied to you, saying he couldn't consummate the marriage because of his health. He was saving himself for me all along. You should really thank yourself for being so filial on our behalf. I'll take good care of the dowry you brought. That jade, gold, antiques, and calligraphy are worth even more now. We'll pass them down to our own children as family heirlooms." My parents-in-law were completely indifferent to my despair. The only thing they cared about was when I would finally die. I sold scrap and even sold my blood to support Greg Carter through school. Yet he shamelessly demanded, "Sister-in-law, you gave my brother so much dowry, there must still be some left. Give it all to me. You already donated the inheritance, so you should at least leave me something to remember you by. Otherwise, when you die, I won't let my son perform the mourning rites for you." I coldly told him I had no money. Greg Carter, who had always pretended to be considerate and reasonable, instantly changed his expression. He glared at me viciously and said, "If you won't give me money, then just wait to rot to death here with no one to clean up your body." At that moment, George Carter was still immersed in his performance of deep affection, unable to pull himself out. With trembling hands, he passed me the divorce certificate. His eyes were red as he forced a bitter smile and said, "Angela, don't look back. Look forward. After I die, you'll meet someone who cherishes you more." I nodded and softly replied, Things suddenly went beyond his expectations. George Carter looked confused. He suddenly convulsed violently, clutched a handkerchief, and spat out a mouthful of blood. His eyes were bloodshot as he looked at me with pain and reluctance. I curled my lips into a smile. In my previous life, Ivy Lee once said that George would rather drink chicken blood than fail to trick me into divorcing him. So it was true after all. While he stared at me in shock and disbelief, I calmly sat down and made myself a cup of malted milk. So sweet. In my previous life, I used to get up at 2 in the morning to grind soybeans and make tofu. While my parents-in-law and Greg Carter slept soundly, I had already finished cooking and kept the meal warm on the stove. I left before dawn every day to hawk goods and pack up my stall, then went home only to head straight to the fields to work. My parents-in-law were sick and confined to bed, unable to do heavy labor. My brother-in-law, Greg Carter, was in middle school and came home once every 2 weeks. Sometimes I even had to go down to the river to catch a few fish or shrimp to add to his nutrition. When I finally managed to cut a bit of pork and render out the fat into cracklings, I would not bring myself to eat a single bite. I split it evenly into 2 portions. My parents-in-law needed some oil with their porridge for nourishment, and Greg needed food that could keep his mind working for school. I carefully sealed the pickled vegetables and flatbreads in clean glass jars so that, as long as I packed enough, they could last him until his next trip home. As for myself, every day while waiting for the tofu curd to set, I would gnaw on a few bites of dry hardened corn buns and sweet potatoes, barely getting through another day. At such a young age, I ended up with a severe stomach illness. This jar of malted milk was something I had asked someone to buy for me from a big city. I had originally planned to use it to nourish my parents-in-law. Now, how ridiculous. This family of ingrates could stay as far away from me as possible in this life. When he realized he couldn't cross that bridge and get what he wanted, George Carter could only swallow his pride and approach me with feigned tenderness. "Angela, could you leave me some of your dowry as a keepsake?" I raised my eyes and stared viciously at this scumbag. Amid his puzzled gaze, I agreed readily, saying, "Sure." My family had risen through generations of merchant trade. Even before the founding of the nation, we were already one of the wealthiest families around. For generations afterward, we followed the family precepts of accumulating virtue and doing good deeds. During the war, my grandfather mobilized the entire clan and sold off all our assets to support the resistance. Aside from the old ancestral house, which was untouchable property, all that was left was a small box of gold bars that went to me. As the only daughter, I was doted on endlessly by my parents. They did not place much importance on ancestral sayings about sons being the future or on rebuilding the family fortune. In my previous life, unable to bear leaving alone while he was sick, I told him the secret of the ancestral house. He used my family's ancestral property to support his mistress and raise children. Later, riding the wave of economic reform, he rose rapidly to success. Reborn into this life, I was only grateful that I had not yet told him the secret of the ancestral home. George Carter had been fixated all along on the dozens of gold bars in my dowry. When I agreed to leave them to him as a keepsake, he was overjoyed and rushed out impatiently to share the good news with his white moonlight, Ivy Lee. Taking advantage of the empty house, I felt under the Kang bed for the loose bricks and swapped the copper blocks and gold bars I had prepared earlier with what was hidden there. Back during the period of Japanese occupation, my grandfather had these fake gold bars made to look lifelike in order to deal with collaborators. I was very confident that George Carter, blinded by excitement, would not have the discernment to tell real gold from fake. To be precise, he was overly confident in his own charm. In my previous life, I was utterly devoted to him. With the husband I loved about to die, I had no mind to care about such worldly possessions. I cleared out everything in the house that belonged to me. My parents had already received my notice in advance and arrived with my cousins. All the items I had packed at the door were loaded onto an ox cart. Aside from a few chipped bowls and an iron pot left on the stove, the Carter household had been emptied clean by me. When I married into this family, it was bare. Now it was returned to exactly the same state. My parents and cousins settled me onto the cart. We looked around and smiled. We were going home. That evening, the former parents-in-law and Greg Carter, who had been away, returned home and were stunned by the sight of bare walls and crumbling tiles. They shouted my name everywhere, searching for me. Finally, following information given by neighbors, They stormed aggressively to my family's doorstep. "Angela, come out," George Carter shouted. "Who gave you the nerve to empty out my house? Give back my cotton quilts, my sewing machine, and my bicycle." His mother, who had always pretended to be frail, clutched her chest dramatically. Greg Carter and my former father-in-law, Daniel Carter, who followed behind her, were also filled with righteous indignation. Villagers crowded around tightly, watching the spectacle. Before my parents could even step outside and speak, Daniel Carter seized the initiative and pointed an accusing finger, shouting, "In-law, is this how you taught your daughter?" They showed up without even saying hello, stormed straight to my parents' home, and accused me of emptying out their house. "Hurry up and have Angela come out and go back home with us," Daniel Carter shouted. "Everything has to be returned, not a single item missing." The moment his words fell, my aunt stepped forward and spat straight in his face. "Return your ass, shut your damn mouth. Everything in your house refers to before Angela married into your family. 3 generations of the Carter family together couldn't scrape up a single decent outfit. That bicycle, the sewing machine, the cotton quilts and blankets, every single one of them was dowry my brother and sister-in-law prepared for Angela. Even the clothes your youngest son is wearing were made from fabric that came from my niece's dowry. Your stuff? What stuff does your family even have?" The villagers burst into laughter and began pointing and whispering at the 3 members of the Carter family. Greg Carter's face flushed red. He nervously tugged at his clothes, secretly resenting this sharp-tongued aunt from my family. Her words were far too cutting. In his mind, once something entered the Carter household, it naturally belonged to the Carters. How could there still be any distinction between yours and mine? His older brother had been far too polite. If it were up to him, he would have humiliated me publicly first, then seized all the dowry and kicked me out. How could they possibly let me get divorced and leave so easily? Daniel Carter was scolded to the point that he could barely lift his head. Remembering that everything had been arranged by his eldest son, he hardened his scalp and argued stubbornly. "Your daughter entered our family for a whole year without getting pregnant. My son just fell ill, and your daughter immediately demanded a divorce. Not only that, she took everything from our house when she left. Everyone here, judge for yourselves. What kind of ungrateful white-eyed wolf does something like this?" The tide among the villagers instantly turned. One after another, they began accusing me and my parents of behaving improperly. Daniel Carter rolled his eyes smugly, pleased with himself. His eldest son had been right. People always sided with the weaker party. Even if they didn't understand why their daughter-in-law hadn't followed the script they had set, the fact remained that she entered the marriage without bearing children, then forced a divorce when her husband became ill. In the eyes of a justice-loving crowd, that alone was indefensible. And with the divorce certificate already issued, there was no way to argue it away. For the sake of their reputation, the Ann family would have to send Angela back with them, to serve like an ox or a horse, subsidize the household, and take care of her parents-in-law. They might even have to throw in some money to beg the Carter family. Greg Carter stepped forward and spoke gently. "Sister-in-law, I know you're not that kind of person. Come back home with us. With my brother gone, my parents and I will take care of you. If there's a suitable match later, we'll help look for one too. We're not stopping you from leaving, we're just worried about you." His words sounded sweeter than a song. He and his parents were playing their old roles again, one good cop, one bad cop. In my previous life, they had spun me around like a top with this exact routine. Greg had been scheming from a very young age. The plan for George Carter to fake his death, reunite with his white moonlight, and leave me behind in the Carter household, to toil like a beast, had largely been his idea. Yet back then, Greg had firmly opposed George divorcing me. He once said, "Only my idiot brother would divorce you. If it were me, I'd never do it. What if you ran away? Then everything would be lost, but my brother said you were completely devoted to him and would never leave." It turned out the act really worked, and there really was a woman as stupid as me. In my despair, he gave a vicious smile and said, "It wasn't for nothing that I took the risk of pushing you into the water. My brother pretended to drown and then saved you. One performance, infinite profit. It was a damn good deal." I was so shocked that I vomited blood on the spot. So even the rescue I had believed saved my life was fake. Back then, George Carter would rather choke on water himself just to pull me ashore. Every ounce of his devotion had been nothing but an act. Now the smug faces of the Carter family overlapped perfectly with my previous life. Hatred surged violently inside me. I turned to the crowd, covered my face, and cried out in humiliation, "George Carter is impotent, and he beats and abuses me. Now his entire family has come here to force me to my death. I won't live anymore," I shouted. Then turned and charged straight toward the well. Those words exploded like cold water poured into hot oil. That very day, I revealed George Carter's secret in a shocking manner, and then went to the clinic. Under examination by several experienced doctors and the village midwives who had spent their entire lives delivering babies, it was concluded that I was still a virgin. Everyone was furious on my behalf, especially after they saw the bruises, blue and purple marks, that I had deliberately pinched onto my arms and legs ahead of time. One after another, they cursed George Carter as a beast and declared the Carter household a den of wolves and tigers. My parents and my uncles and aunts rushed forward, beating and cursing the Carter family. Greg Carter failed to dodge and was punched in the face by several of my cousins, shattering his glasses on the spot. In the chaos, he was also stomped several times by villagers who were standing up for me, breaking several fingers then and there. If not for the team leader and several members of the Carter clan arriving in time, whether Daniel Carter and Greg Carter could have walked out alive would have been anyone's guess. Greg Carter was left bruised and swollen, glaring at me in rage. I refused to back down and spat at him loudly. Greg Carter and my so-called sickly former mother-in-law, Lily Carter, were livid, their faces turning ashen. Looking at Greg's crazed expression, I knew that now he didn't just hate me, he also resented his own brother for abandoning the plan halfway. So I vaguely mentioned that I needed to go to the Carter house to retrieve my dowry. Under everyone's watchful eyes, the space beneath the bed revealed only an empty box. Everything inside had vanished. Greg Carter's expression darkened instantly, like a venomous snake hiding in the mountains. Oh, so the spoils hadn't been divided evenly. In my previous life, before George Carter left, he had kept 5 gold bars aside for the younger brother who helped him plot everything. But now the plan had changed. George had simply altered his promise and flown solo with all the wealth. Earlier, when I caught a distant glimpse of George Carter slipping away through the crowd, I already knew it. Every single member of the Carter family was skilled at reading the wind. Their selfish nature meant they would always make the choice that benefited themselves most, at the first possible moment. I truly looked forward to the day when Greg Carter and George Carter, those brothers who had once appeared so close and loving in my previous life, would turn against each other, tearing each other apart like dogs. After being reborn, I made no effort to hide the drastic change in my temperament. My parents and cousins were both worried and distressed, but I didn't care. I only said that I had been blind before, and that I had completely given up on men from now on. When my family heard this, they hated the Carter family even more fiercely. Several of my younger cousins intercepted Greg Carter on his way to school in town and beat him up together a few times. Maybe they didn't control their strength very well, but they didn't kill him. Instead, his expression and demeanor lost their childishness and became as steady and calculating as in my previous life. Later, Greg Carter confronted me and said coldly, "Sister-in-law, you've been reborn too, haven't you? Your heart is really ruthless. No matter what, we were family for an entire lifetime in the previous life. Toward my parents, those elders, and toward me, a junior, you truly want us wiped out completely." Greg Carter ground his teeth in hatred. I let out a soft laugh. "Since you already know, you still dare to appear in front of me? Are you really asking to die? Say goodnight." I waved to the cousins who were standing nearby, eyeing him like tigers. "Brothers," he threatened me, "beat him." Greg Carter shouted furiously, "Angela, all you know how to do is find helpers. Is this really all you're capable of?" As he grew so angry, he was about to spit blood. I nodded cheerfully. "Of course." In my previous life, George Carter had once said smugly, "Your parents and relatives are all gone. Even if I kill you, no one will care. Greg Carter stood at his side, helping him scheme how to make me die faster and more painfully. Now my parents and all my relatives were safely with the N family. Among several generations, I was the only daughter, and my cousins listened to me without question. Greg Carter could only consider himself unlucky and accept it as atonement for his entire family. I left him with a warning. From now on, don't ever let me see anyone from the Carter family showing off in front of me. Otherwise, every time I see you, I'll beat you. After throwing out those words, I turned and walked away, leaving behind Greg Carter, bruised and swollen from the beating. Greg Carter roared madly behind me. Don't think that just because you left, we won't survive. You know very well what kind of position my brother and I reached in our previous life. There will come a day when you'll be kneeling and begging me. I sneered inwardly. Wishful thinking. If you really have that kind of ability, you should first think about how you're going to pay your high school tuition for the next semester. After returning home, I gathered my cousins, both older and younger, and held a meeting. When they heard me say that I wanted them to study hard and get into college, several of them immediately sighed and complained bitterly. I hardened my heart and ignored it. No matter the era, studying was always the most straightforward path out. My own age was no longer suitable for returning to school, and besides, with the experience of my previous life, I wanted to do things I was better at. In my previous life, I had built up a solid business step by step on my own. The Carter elders, including Greg Carter, his wife, and even his son, were all supported by me. The main reason Greg Carter and the Carter elders hated me so deeply, despite being supported by me for so long, was precisely because I had accumulated such a large fortune, yet only left them enough money to live on, donating everything else to the country. The Ann family firmly remembered our ancestral teachings. What is taken from the people should be returned to the people. Because of this, George Carter and I were never meant to be husband and wife from the very beginning. After settling things at home, I took several small gold bars to a gold shop and exchanged them for cash. Then I went to the outskirts of the city, which were still relatively desolate at the time, and purchased several street-front properties at reasonable prices. Within 2 years, the largest hospital in the city would be built there. Later, those few streets would become unimaginably prosperous, with shops so sought after that none were ever vacant. After finishing all this, I opened a restaurant and a scrap recycling station. I invited my second aunt to be the head cook at the restaurant. Her ancestors had once served as imperial chefs. Back then, a single dish she casually made, amber-glazed pork, had earned endless praise from a senior leader who came to inspect the West District. Later, that leader even spared no expense to buy the dish for his father, who had a poor appetite. Unfortunately, my second aunt became overly exhausted and, in a moment of disorientation, severed the tendon in her wrist. After that, she could no longer hold a knife. So when my second aunt later said she wanted to work an office job at the steel factory to help support the household, I insisted that my parents refuse together with me. I personally handed her the keys to the fully renovated restaurant and said, "Aunt, from now on, we'll split the profits 50-50. I'll provide the capital and ingredients, and you'll provide the skill. Once my older brother and younger brothers get married, we'll change it to an 80-20 split." My second aunt froze for a moment, murmuring, "Why does this feel so strange?" But the restaurant soon opened with roaring success, bringing in money every day. I then went to the scrap recycling station where I had earned my first pot of gold in my previous life, and bought everything there for $500, including the property rights. At this time, people still didn't place much value on precious cultural relics and ancient books. In my previous life, relying on the discerning eye passed down from my ancestors, I had bought ancient books and documents that others considered worthless and stored them properly. Several heavyweight calligraphy and paintings later fetched sky-high prices at international auctions, eventually being repurchased by domestic wealthy families and passed down as heirlooms. My second aunt and I ran our businesses with great momentum, and my parents were also inspired by us. At my suggestion, they decided to resign from their positions and go into business. At that time, most people still worshipped the iron rice bowl of state jobs. Every household lived on a fixed salary, and savings rarely exceeded 200. Yet privately, many households worth tens of thousands had already seized this wave and begun building their own ventures, with quite a few eventually growing to a considerable scale. For example, there was the scrap recycling station run by the old fisherman family next door to us. No one could tell that such a small, unremarkable operation would one day grow so large. It started by supplying cardboard boxes to city enterprises, then gradually expanded into a full production line. After accumulating enough capital, they made a shrewd move into mining investments. By the early years of the 21st century, that plain-looking couple had already become names on the Forbes rich list. I decided to stand on the shoulders of giants and look at the world, to follow closely in the footsteps of those who had already succeeded, and to place unwavering faith in them. Decades later, I built a family business even more successful than the one in my previous life. By then, the couple I called Sister U and her husband and I had become friends who would stake our lives for one another. Sister U once said to me with deep emotion, "Angela, aside from my own sister and my husband, you're the person who trusts me the most. Every time I was lost, you stood firmly by my side and gave me strength and encouragement. Without you, there wouldn't be the two of us today." I only felt embarrassed, chuckled foolishly, and quickly changed the subject. Time flew by in the blink of an eye. Once my second aunt's cooking officially hit the market, it was immediately adored by diners everywhere. What began with a few rich, oil-heavy signature dishes like amber pork and supreme fragrance gradually expanded into the 8 Delicacies banquet, a private club-style dining concept. Chain locations opened as far away as the provincial capital hundreds of miles off. Describing the profits as pouring in by the bucketful was no exaggeration at all. In just a few days, it would be Lunar New Year's Eve. While our family was going over the accounts, one of my cousins told me something unusual. He said that the Carter family's second son, Greg Carter, had failed the college entrance exam a few years back. The next year, unwilling to accept it, he took the exam again, but under the pressure of working while studying, he had no chance at all and failed once more. Still unwilling to give up, he wanted to repeat the year a third time, but his parents stopped him. Daniel Carter cried and made a scene in front of his youngest son, saying the family truly couldn't scrape together any more money. Creditors were showing up at their door every day demanding repayment, and there was simply no way to borrow more. Greg Carter looked unwillingly at their impoverished mud house and the pitiful corn buns and pickled vegetables on the table day after day. At last, he resigned himself to fate, threw down his books, and prepared to go into business. When I heard this, my eyes flickered. I couldn't tell whether what I felt was regret or satisfaction. In my previous life, I had worked myself to the bone to support the family, leaving the Carter elders and Greg Carter with no pressure at all. They lived comfortably, and in the hardest year, I even sold blood so Greg could repeat his studies. The very next year, he got into college, chose his desired major, later married his advisor's daughter, and became a nationally renowned professor. Reborn into this life, Greg Carter naturally wanted to walk that same stable, familiar path. But the Carter parents, who pretended to be frail and sick day in and day out, not only couldn't provide him with a worry-free safety net, they instead waited on him hand and foot, expecting him to serve them constantly. Every day, he had to walk more than 20 miles of mountain roads to attend school, because he couldn't afford to live on campus. After classes, he still had to work in the fields, wash clothes, cook meals, and feed the pigs and chickens. Compared to other families who poured all their efforts into helping their children prepare for the exam, his failure was practically a foregone conclusion. After failing, Greg Carter's greedy eyes turned toward me once again. He deliberately opened a restaurant directly across the street from mine, openly challenging us head-on. In my previous life, Greg had been both aloof and arrogant, yet vicious at heart. His so-called brilliant business strategy was simply to copy every single dish from our menu and sell them at half price. It was child's play. Setting aside the fact that the cook he hired, who only knew how to make mass canteen food, could never compare to my second aunt's inherited imperial chef recipes. His suicidal discount strategy alone wouldn't last 3 months. So my second aunt and I decided to ignore him completely. No matter how loudly Daniel Carter and Greg Carter bragged outside, we remained calm and unfazed, continuing to develop expensive, limited-quantity specialty dishes. As expected, by the second month after the Carter family's restaurant opened, they were unable to pay the wages of the cooks and servers. Someone reported them to the labor union, and the place was ordered to suspend operations for rectification. 1 week later, a transfer notice was posted directly on the door. Villagers said that the Carter parents and their younger son were fighting non-stop at home. The family had already been dirt poor, and now they smashed the place so thoroughly that they couldn't even find a single bowl to drink water from. Just as the three of them, each harboring their own thoughts, were tearing into one another and exposing old grievances, someone knocked on the door. "Mom, Dad, little brother, I'm back." George Carter, who had faked his death and disappeared for years, appeared at the dilapidated Carter house with his woman and child in tow. To the three Carters who had been pushed to a dead end, this was like a blinding beam of golden light. The gold bars George had secretly taken away meant that all their debts and difficulties could finally be resolved. So Greg Carter and George Carter, the two brothers, barely exchanged any pleasantries before getting straight to the point. "Big brother, where are those gold bars? Give me a few, I'm in a hurry to pay off debts." "Little brother," George said impatiently, "I heard our family opened a restaurant. Give me some money. I haven't even paid for my return trip yet." The news spread rapidly. The Carter family's eldest son, who died years ago, is back. The Carter family's eldest son fought with the second son. The Carter family's eldest son fought with the old couple. In this era of scarce information, 1 or 2 sensational events could grow wings and fly through every street and alley. By the time everyone knew that the Carter family's eldest son, who had supposedly died of illness while away, had returned, and that the whole family had already fought their way into the police station, the police officers had given them a stern reprimand. The group sat dejectedly, in a house with broken tables and missing chair legs, staring at one another in silence. George Carter impatiently sent Ivy Lee to sleep in the West Room. Over the past few days, they had hitchhiked on freight trains, hiding and sneaking around, starving and freezing. He was already exhausted beyond belief. After finally returning home, he hadn't even eaten a proper meal before getting into a fight with his younger brother and ending up at the police station. Now that they were finally back, not only was there no welcoming feast prepared for him, there wasn't even a sip of water. George was furious. After hearing what his parents and Greg said, his anger surged even more. "Angela, that damn woman," he cursed bitterly. "I thought that after I faked my death she would take good care of my parents and brother, so I wouldn't have any worries. But what happened? The very day we divorced, she ran back to her parents' home and never came back." George pressed down the corner of his mouth darkly. What made him even more furious was that, over the past couple of days, everyone he met had been pointing and whispering about that issue. He had been confused at first, until he heard Greg say that Angela had claimed back then that she couldn't endure it. When George thought of the looks from the villagers, his eyes turned red with rage. His parents clutched at him, recounting all the hardships they had endured over the years. His younger brother was full of resentment, angrily condemning him for taking all the gold bars and leaving, abandoning the family to their fate. George swallowed bitterness, unable to speak. "Those gold bars, they're fake. They're fake." Greg sneered. "Big brother, we're not idiots. Either you give me half of those gold bars, or I'll go tell Angela's brothers about how you stole the gold, pretended to be sick, and faked your death. So the things that happened to my sister-in-law in her previous life weren't mainly my fault," Greg added coldly. "Every debt has its owner. If you want to settle accounts, settle them with my big brother. Don't come after me." Outside the private room, my second aunt and several cousins glared fiercely at Greg Carter. Facing Greg's earnest expression, as he claimed he had come to seek refuge, I once again marveled at how every single member of the Carter family was truly a born actor. No matter how they performed, It was all for profit. What Greg Carter could never have imagined was that his good big brother, George Carter, had already come to see me the day before. And what George said was the complete opposite. His face had been filled with helpless resignation, as if everything were nothing more than a cruel twist of fate. His face was filled with sorrow and misery. Angela, I never expected that my illness was actually a misdiagnosis by the doctor. Everything was just fate playing tricks on us. Back then, Greg gave me the idea, telling me to fake a divorce and trick you into staying behind to take care of my parents. But I loved you too much, I couldn't bear to do it. Now that I see you're living well, I can finally feel at ease. A single tear slid down his gaunt, haggard face and fell onto the ground. George Carter tilted his head upward at a 35-degree angle, staring into the sky, leaving me with a slanted silhouette of despairing, obsessive devotion. I was a little speechless. If this had been George Carter from a few years earlier, with his ability to read people and play to their emotions, that pretty boy face of his might still have counted for something. But now, where exactly did his confidence come from? With that aged, sallow, worn-out face of his, all it did was make people feel sick to their stomachs. So I very sincerely agreed to Greg Carter's proposal for a truce, and made one condition. Since you come back, your brother should be able to come back too. In my previous life, he solved the riddle left behind by my great-grandfather and dug up a large cache of treasure from my family's land. As long as you get the location out of him, I'll split it 50-50 with you. Greg Carter agreed excitedly. A cousin who followed him reported that Greg went to the market and bought several sturdy ropes as well as knives, an axe, and pliers. My cousin couldn't figure it out at all. Was the Carter family planning to slaughter a pig? When George Carter was finally rescued, he was already completely deranged. Educated people had their own distinctive methods of forcing confessions. His face and body were covered in injuries, burns from hot oil, cuts from knives, and marks from pliers. One of his legs had been smashed and broken, and all 10 of his fingernails had been pulled out. When villagers found him in the back hills, he was unconscious by the roadside. If no one had happened to pass by nightfall, he might have been dragged into a wolf's den. When Greg Carter was caught, his condition was not much better than George's. He was raving mad, holding a blood-soaked cleaver and screaming, "It was all George's fault. I was supposed to marry a rich, beautiful woman and become a professor. My sister-in-law was supposed to support me through college." The villagers whispered among themselves, full of curiosity. Greg's sister-in-law, isn't she that Ivy Lee woman George brought home? Didn't people say that eldest daughter-in-law did nothing all day except eat and lie in bed, never lifting a finger? How could she afford to support Greg through college? Others scoffed. You believe the words of a madman? If you ask me, the Carter family probably picked a bad ancestral grave. One son's gone crazy, the other's crippled. Even the eldest son, he was practically dead and then came back to life, bringing a wife and child with him. He can't even perform as a man. Who knows whose kid he's raising? Ivy Lee's face was waxy yellow, her eyes vacant as she sat there in a daze. Ever since the Carter family's incident 10 days earlier, she'd been squatting at my doorstep, refusing to leave. Her mouth kept muttering over and over, "They're all liars. The gold was fake. There were no gold bars. It's all over." My parents and cousins tried to chase her away several times. Every time more people gathered, she would clutch her head, squat on the ground, and scream, "Don't hit me, don't hit me, I was wrong." The neighbors and even the police had no idea what to do with her. Later, I told my family to just let her lie there if she wanted. I had already bought a larger temporary plot of land and moved everything over. This place was only waiting to be demolished anyway and served no other purpose. As a woman, I pitied her child. Not laying a hand on her was already the greatest mercy I could offer. George Carter tried to push her out as a shield, wanting to dump all the blame onto Ivy Lee and Greg Carter. Deep down, he was still fantasizing that I, the ex-wife who had once loved him deeply, would return to his side and continue to toil like an ox or a horse for him. No, that wasn't quite it. He knew I was rich now. He fantasized that I would take him in, feed him delicacies every day, hand over all my businesses to him, return to the family, and bear children for him. Trying to win my favor, George Carter crossed the bridge holding a scraggly bundle of wildflowers. With complete confidence, he said, "Angela, I finally realize now that you're the one who suits me best. Let's remarry. From now on, you'll never lose me again. Aren't you happy?" Happy? I was thrilled beyond words. "You brat, you ran fast back then and avoided a beating. Now we'll make up for it." My parents and my cousins, fully prepared, surrounded George Carter tightly. His cries for mercy echoed endlessly through the alley. Still unwilling to give up, he came back several more times after that. Every single time, he was beaten until his face was swollen and bruised. Only when he finally realized that I truly didn't love him at all, on the contrary, that I felt nothing but disgust and revulsion toward him, did he stop appearing. Time moved on into the 1990s. My business grew larger and stronger with each passing year. My cousins also flourished in the fields they were best at. By now, my parents no longer pressured me about getting married or having children. I adopted a pair of sisters from an orphanage whose parents had both passed away. Aside from some initial awkwardness, my parents were quickly conquered by the soft, sweet little girls and came to love them as their own, cherishing them from the bottom of their hearts. After a family discussion, we unanimously decided to donate the cultural relics, ancient books, calligraphy and paintings from the ancestral house to the National Museum for proper preservation. Every year, I donated 1/3 of the group's profits to national scientific research institutions. When I turned 40, the state awarded me an honorary title and a medal. Countless television stations and newspapers reported on it. At the same time, a crazed man serving time in a psychiatric institution screamed at the television, "That's my money. All of that should have been mine." A few days later, he died in his sleep from a myocardial infarction. George Carter's parents had long since split households with their eldest son's family. In this life, without my support, the two elders, unwilling to work or endure hardship, could only beg on the streets. George Carter and Ivy Lee, aside from saying a few pleasant words, refused to give them a single cent to support them. Bookmark, go back. One day, while I was traveling abroad with my parents, my youngest daughter, always soft-hearted and kind, saw two elderly people begging by the roadside. She deliberately got out of the car to give them a few packs of biscuits and $100. After we got back in the car, the innocent child asked curiously, "Mom, those two grandparents kept looking at you and crying. What happened to them?" I replied calmly, "We don't need to be curious about other people's fate. As long as we live with a clear conscience, that's enough." For the rest of my life, there would be no more shadows, only an open road ahead.